"No one in this room speaks Arabic," Ethan Caldwell said with a confident smile as he lifted his crystal glass. The words floated above the table like a locked door. A door he believed no one else could open. Soft jazz drifted through the private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Crown, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Golden light reflected across polished marble walls. The skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, glittering beneath the night sky like a sea of diamonds. Every chair around the long walnut table was occupied by people who moved markets, funded governments, and signed deals worth more money than most Americans would earn in 100 lifetimes. At the center sat Ethan Caldwell, the white billionaire CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, a technology empire valued at nearly $12 billion. Across from him sat Victor Langford, another billionaire whose investment firm quietly controlled pieces of industries all over the world. Tonight's dinner appeared ordinary to anyone watching from a distance. Expensive wine, fine dining, careful smiles. But beneath the elegance, something far more important was unfolding. The two men exchanged a glance before shifting effortlessly into Arabic. Their voices lowered, their expressions sharpened. The conversation became private, or at least they believed it had. Moving silently between tables was a young black waitress named Zora Bennett, 27 years old, slim build, calm eyes, perfect posture, the kind of employee guests barely noticed unless their water glass needed refilling. She wore the same black uniform as every other server in the restaurant, the same polished shoes, the same name tag. To most people in the room, she was invisible, just another waitress carrying trays through a world she did not belong to, or so they assumed. Zora approached the table carrying a bottle of sparkling mineral water. The executives never paused their discussion. Why would they? In their minds, she was background noise, a shadow moving through the room, someone whose entire purpose was to serve and disappear. Ethan chuckled softly as Victor responded in Arabic. Several men around the table laughed. Their confidence filled the room. Their words became quicker, more relaxed, more dangerous. Zora poured water into a crystal glass without spilling a single drop. Her expression never changed. Not when Ethan spoke. Not when Victor answered. Not when another executive leaned forward and asked a question in Arabic that caused several people to exchange knowing smiles. She simply continued her work. Calm, professional, silent. Yet behind those steady eyes, every sentence landed with perfect clarity. Every word, every detail, every hidden meaning. Because what none of them knew was that Zora Bennett understood Arabic as fluently as English. She understood the jokes. She understood the numbers. She understood the names being mentioned. And as the conversation continued, something inside her began to tighten. The laughter around the table grew louder. The confidence grew stronger. The men believed they were protected by a language no one else could understand. But the woman standing only 3 feet away understood everything. And before the night was over, the secret they believed was safely hidden behind foreign words would become the most expensive mistake of their lives. Most people are not born invisible. They become invisible after years of being overlooked. Zora Bennett understood that better than anyone. Earlier that morning, long before the city lights painted Manhattan in gold and silver, she had been sitting beside a hospital window 12 miles away, helping her mother finish breakfast before another round of treatment. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The television played quietly in the background. Outside, traffic crawled through the streets below. Her mother smiled the same way she always did, as if she were protecting her daughter from worries she could no longer hide. Medical bills had a way of turning months into years. They had a way of reshaping dreams. 5 years earlier, Zora had graduated near the top of her class from Georgetown University. Languages came naturally to her. English, Arabic, French, Spanish. She could switch between them as easily as most people change channels on a television. Her professors believed she would become a diplomat, an international consultant, maybe even a translator for world leaders. Life had different plans. When her mother became ill, opportunities were replaced by responsibilities. The overseas programs disappeared. The corporate interviews ended. The student loans remained. So did the hospital invoices. And so Zora accepted a position at the Meridian Crown. At first she told herself it would only be temporary. A few months became a few years. Yet she never stopped learning. Every break was spent reading. Every train ride became a classroom. Every spare dollar purchased another book. Knowledge became her private rebellion against circumstances she could not control. The guests who filled the restaurant each night never knew any of this. They saw a black waitress carrying trays through crowded dining rooms. They saw a uniform. They saw a name tag. They saw exactly what they expected to see. Nothing more. That misunderstanding had become one of her greatest advantages. People revealed themselves around those they considered invisible. They spoke freely. They lowered their guard. They assumed she could not understand conversations that were never intended for her ears. Tonight was proving that lesson once again. Back inside the private dining room, the executives continued speaking Arabic between expensive meals and carefully measured smiles. Zora moved quietly around the table collecting empty glasses. Her expression remained calm, professional, controlled. Yet beneath the surface, every sentence was finding its place inside her memory. Names, dates, numbers, percentages, promises. The details connected together piece by piece like a puzzle assembling itself. Then Ethan said something that caused Victor to laugh. Not a polite laugh, confident one. The kind shared by people who believed they were completely safe. Zora lowered her eyes toward the tray in her hands and continued walking. But inside, a small feeling began to grow. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was certainty. Whatever was happening at that table was far bigger than a routine business dinner. And before the night ended, she suspected she would learn exactly how big it really was. The evening moved forward with the polished rhythm of a machine designed to impress powerful people. Waiters glided between tables. Crystal glasses reflected warm amber light. Beyond the windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a blanket of stars and office towers. Yet inside the private dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. Zora could feel it. The executives were becoming more comfortable, more relaxed, more willing to reveal what they truly thought. That was often how secrets escaped, not through carelessness but through confidence. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair and loosened his posture. Victor Langford reviewed a document displayed on a tablet while several investors listened carefully. Their conversation remained in Arabic. Fast, precise, hidden from everyone around them, or so they believed. Zora approached with a tray carrying fresh glasses. As she moved closer, certain words began appearing repeatedly. Acquisition, transfer, valuation, regulatory review. The language itself was not unusual. Billion-dollar deals were discussed every day in rooms like this. What caught her attention was the tone. They were not discussing possibilities. They were discussing outcomes as if the future had already been decided. Victor tapped the screen and spoke quietly. Ethan smiled immediately afterward. Several executives exchanged approving nods. One investor even laughed softly before raising his glass. Zora set down a fresh bottle of sparkling water and continued listening without appearing to listen at all. Years of practice had taught her that the best disguise was authenticity. People rarely questioned what looked normal. A waitress serving drinks looked normal. A waitress studying every word in 4 different languages did not. She moved away from the table and crossed toward the service station. From there, she could still hear fragments of the conversation. Numbers were mentioned. Large numbers. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Then came a company name she recognized. Whitmore Biotech. Zora paused for only half a second before continuing her work. She knew that name. Almost everyone in New York's business community did. Whitmore Biotech was one of the fastest-growing healthcare technology companies in the country. Its founder, Claire Whitmore, had built a reputation for protecting patient privacy and ethical innovation. Investors respected her. Employees admired her. Customers trusted her. Yet the men at the table were speaking about her company as though it were already theirs. Another sentence followed. Then another. The pieces continued fitting together. This dinner was not a celebration. It was preparation. Something was being arranged behind closed doors. Something involving Whitmore Biotech. Something worth nearly $900 million. Ethan raised his glass again and smiled as Victor described the final stage of their strategy. Around the table, confidence spread like sunlight. Nobody looked worried. Nobody looked uncertain. Why would they? They believed they controlled every variable, every document, every conversation, every witness. Across the room, Zora Bennett collected a stack of empty plates and kept walking. Her face remained calm, professional, unreadable. But deep inside, the certainty she had felt earlier was growing stronger with every passing minute. The men at that table were not simply discussing a business opportunity. They were discussing a plan. And for the first time that evening, Zora began wondering whether someone needed to know what she had heard. The next 20 minutes changed everything. Zora moved through the dining room carrying plates of sea bass, glasses of sparkling water, and expressions she did not truly feel. Around her, the restaurant continued performing its nightly illusion. Silverware clinked softly against fine china. Conversations floated through the air. A pianist played near the main lounge. From a distance, it looked like another ordinary evening among New York's elite. But inside the private room, the conversation had become far more revealing. Ethan Caldwell checked his watch before speaking again in Arabic. This time his voice was lower, more focused. Victor Langford responded immediately. The confidence between them was unmistakable. They were no longer discussing what might happen. They were discussing what they expected to happen. Zora approached the table with a fresh bottle of mineral water. As she poured, several words caught her attention. Board approval, data transfer, temporary restructuring, regulatory delay. Individually, none of those terms sounded alarming. Together, they formed something else entirely. Then came the sentence that made her stomach tighten. Victor explained that once the acquisition closed, certain customer information could be moved into a separate subsidiary before regulators had time to review the transition. Ethan smiled and replied that the process would be completed long before anyone realized what had happened. Several executives nodded approvingly. One called it efficient. Another called it inevitable. Zora kept pouring. Her hands remained steady. Years of customer service had taught her how to remain calm when emotions demanded otherwise. Yet every word was now echoing inside her mind. Whitmore Biotech had built its reputation on protecting sensitive medical information. Patients trusted the company because Claire Whitmore had spent years publicly defending ethical standards in healthcare technology. The people at this table were speaking as though those promises were obstacles to be removed. A few minutes later, another executive asked whether Claire would agree to the final terms. Ethan laughed softly before answering. According to him, she would never see the complete picture until after the documents were signed. The men around the table exchanged knowing smiles. One investor raised a glass in celebration. Another joked that transparency was only useful when it served a purpose. The laughter that followed sounded harmless to everyone else in the room. To Zora, it sounded different. It sounded like people congratulating themselves for getting away with something. She stepped away from the table and entered the service corridor behind the dining room. The noise faded slightly. Stainless steel counters reflected the bright kitchen lights. Waiters rushed past carrying trays. Orders were called out. Nobody noticed the concern growing behind her eyes. Zora leaned against the counter for a brief moment and replayed everything she had heard. The names, the numbers, the timelines, the strategy. None of it felt accidental. None of it felt ethical. Then she remembered something else. Claire Whitmore was scheduled to arrive later that evening for the final stage of negotiations. Zora had seen the reservation notes hours earlier. Suddenly the timeline made sense. The celebration was happening before the deal was even signed because the men at that table believed the outcome was already guaranteed. For the first time all night, Zora stopped wondering whether she should pay attention. The real question had become something much harder. What was she supposed to do with the truth now that she had it? Truth becomes heavy when you are the only person carrying it. Zora returned to the dining room with a fresh tray balanced carefully in her hands, but her thoughts were no longer focused on service. Every step felt different now. Every conversation sounded sharper. Every smile around the room seemed to hide another layer beneath it. The executives continued celebrating quietly inside their private corner of the restaurant. To anyone watching, they looked successful, respected, untouchable. Yet Zora now understood something most people never would. Power often sounded calm long before it became dangerous. She placed a glass beside a guest and glanced toward the reservation podium near the entrance. The arrival list remained open on the screen. One name immediately caught her attention. Claire Whitmore. Estimated arrival, 9:15 p.m. Zora checked the clock mounted above the service station. 9 o'clock, 15 minutes. That was all. 15 minutes before the woman at the center of the conversation walked into a room where everyone else seemed to know the ending except her. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She tried focusing on work. She collected empty plates, refilled water glasses, delivered desserts. But the words she had heard refused to leave her mind. She remembered her mother's voice from years ago. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. It was a lesson repeated throughout her childhood. A lesson that seemed simple until life presented a real test. Because doing the right thing was easy when nothing was at risk. Tonight was different. If she spoke up, she could lose everything. The Meridian Crown paid enough to keep medical bills under control. It paid enough to keep her apartment. It paid enough to help her mother continue treatment. One complaint from a billionaire guest could end that security overnight. On the other hand, remaining silent carried its own cost. Somewhere beyond the glass walls of this restaurant were thousands of patients who trusted Whitmore Biotech with their information. Employees trusted Claire Whitmore to protect the company she had spent years building. Investors trusted her leadership. And according to everything Zora had heard, those people were walking toward a future they did not fully understand. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the private dining room. Ethan Caldwell had just finished another story. The men around him smiled. Victor Langford raised his glass. Their confidence seemed almost effortless. They were not worried about resistance because they expected none. After all, who would challenge them? Certainly not a waitress. That assumption followed Zora through every shift she worked. Most guests never looked directly at her. They saw a uniform and stopped there. They never asked what books she read. They never asked how many languages she spoke. They never imagined she might understand conversations they considered private. Invisible people often carried the most information because nobody bothered hiding it from them. Then the elevator doors opened across the lobby. Several guests turned. The hostess straightened her posture. A woman stepped into the restaurant wearing a navy business suit and carrying herself with quiet confidence. Claire Whitmore had arrived. The room seemed to shift around her. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Investors recognized her immediately. Zora felt her pulse quicken. The timeline she had been dreading was no longer approaching. It was here. In a matter of minutes, Claire Whitmore would sit at that table. And Zora Bennett would have to decide whether silence was safer than truth. Claire Whitmore entered the private dining room with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years earning respect instead of demanding it. Conversations softened as she approached the table. Ethan Caldwell stood first, followed by Victor Langford and the other executives. Hands were shaken. Compliments were exchanged. Smiles appeared exactly where they were expected. From a distance, it looked like the beginning of a historic partnership. Up close, Zora Bennett saw something different. She saw people acting out a script whose ending had already been written. Claire took her seat near the center of the table. A leather portfolio rested beside her chair. The final documents would be reviewed tonight. If everything proceeded according to schedule, signatures would follow before midnight. The investors seemed delighted. Ethan appeared especially relaxed. He ordered another bottle of sparkling water and resumed speaking in English for the benefit of the room. The discussion focused on innovation, patient care, and long-term growth. Every phrase sounded polished. Every promise sounded responsible. Yet Zora knew what had been said when English was not being spoken. She knew the private version of the conversation. She knew the details hidden behind the presentation. As the meeting continued, she carried a tray toward the table. Her heartbeat felt louder than the piano music drifting from the main dining room. She set down fresh glasses and stepped back. The opportunity to remain silent still existed. She could walk away, finish her shift, collect her paycheck, return home. Nobody expected anything from her. Nobody would blame her. That was the strange thing about being invisible. People rarely expected courage from someone they refused to see. Claire opened the portfolio and reviewed the first page. Ethan exchanged a glance with Victor. The room grew quieter. Several investors leaned forward. A pen appeared beside the documents. Zora felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment. Not later. Not tomorrow. Now. She looked around the room one last time. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Powerful people sat comfortably in expensive chairs, convinced they understood everything happening around them. None of them were looking at her. Then Zora stepped forward. Her voice was calm, clear, professional. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. The room froze. Claire looked up first. Ethan frowned slightly. A waitress interrupting a negotiation was unusual enough to command attention. "I apologize for speaking out of turn," Zora continued. "But before you sign those documents, there is something you deserve to know." Silence spread across the table. Ethan's expression hardened. Victor stared at her. One investor lowered his glass halfway to the table. Claire remained composed. "What is it?" she asked. Zora took a slow breath. Then she answered in flawless Arabic. The reaction was immediate. Chairs stopped moving. Smiles disappeared. Several executives stared at her as though they had forgotten how to blink. Ethan's face lost color. Victor's eyes widened. For the first time that night, the most powerful men in the room looked uncertain. Zora repeated a sentence she had heard less than an hour earlier. Word for word. Perfectly. In the same language they believed nobody else understood. And suddenly the secret conversation was no longer a secret. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than the skyline outside the windows. Ethan Caldwell stared at Zora Bennett as though he were seeing her for the first time. Victor Langford remained frozen in his chair. Around the table, investors exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier had begun to crack. Claire Whitmore slowly closed the portfolio in front of her. Her attention never left Zora. "How do you speak Arabic?" one executive finally asked. Zora ignored the question. That was not what mattered. What mattered was the truth. She calmly repeated another sentence from the private conversation. Then another. Dates. Numbers. References to the restructuring plan. References to moving sensitive assets before regulators could review the transition. Each statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. The room changed with every word. Ethan attempted a smile. It looked forced. "You are misunderstanding a complex business discussion," he said. His voice remained polite, but the certainty was gone. Zora looked directly at him. "Then perhaps you can explain why you said the review process would be completed before anyone realized what had happened." The sentence was repeated in perfect Arabic. Every syllable, every inflection, every pause. Several executives lowered their eyes. Claire Whitmore turned slowly toward Ethan. Her expression remained calm, but something behind her eyes had sharpened. "Did you say that?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than any explanation. Victor stepped forward instead. He claimed the comments had been taken out of context. He insisted that strategic planning often sounded different in private discussions. But then another problem emerged. One investor sitting near the end of the table cleared his throat. Earlier in the evening, he had quietly activated the translation feature on his tablet while reviewing international market reports. He had not been paying close attention at first, but after hearing Zora speak, curiosity led him to check the device's transcript history. His face changed as he reviewed the translated text. Slowly, he turned the screen toward Claire. Nobody needed to speak. The words were already there. Not perfect, not complete, but accurate enough. The room seemed to shrink. Claire studied the transcript carefully. The investors leaned closer. Questions began appearing from every direction. Some were directed at Ethan, others at Victor. Timelines were challenged. Assumptions were questioned. Explanations became longer, less convincing. Meanwhile, Zora stood quietly beside the table. The woman nobody had noticed for most of the evening had become the center of the entire room. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, because facts have a strange way of commanding attention on their own. Claire finally looked up from the tablet. The documents remained unsigned. The pen beside her folder had not moved. "I think this meeting is over," she said. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated. The investors gathered their materials in silence. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing beneath the night sky. Inside, the future of a $900 million deal had changed direction because one waitress understood words that were never meant for her ears. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful people in the room realized they had underestimated the only person who had truly been paying attention. The fallout began before anyone even left the building. Phones appeared around the table. Messages were sent. Advisors were called. Legal teams suddenly became very interested in details that had seemed unimportant an hour earlier. Claire Whitmore remained composed, but her decision was immediate. The documents were collected, the proposed agreement was suspended, and every discussion regarding the acquisition was placed under review. Ethan Caldwell and Victor Langford attempted to regain control of the conversation, yet every explanation seemed weaker than the one before. Trust, once cracked, rarely returns in the same form. By the time the meeting officially ended, the atmosphere inside the Meridian Crown had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, the room had belonged to billionaires. Now it belonged to questions. Investors who had arrived expecting to celebrate were leaving with concerns. Advisors who had expected signatures were now requesting audits. Even the executives who had supported the deal appeared uncertain. Outside, black luxury sedans lined the street below, their headlights reflecting against rain-slick pavement. Inside, the consequences were only beginning. The following morning, several major stakeholders requested independent reviews of the acquisition proposal. Financial journalists started asking questions after hearing rumors that negotiations had unexpectedly collapsed at the final stage. Industry blogs speculated. Market analysts debated possible reasons. Nobody knew the full story, but everyone knew something unusual had happened. Within 48 hours, the proposed transaction that had seemed unstoppable was effectively frozen. Claire Whitmore ordered a comprehensive internal review of every document connected to the negotiations. Investors praised the decision. Employees at Whitmore Biotech expressed relief. The company that had appeared destined to disappear into a larger corporate structure suddenly had a second chance to determine its own future. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell and Victor Langford faced a very different reality. Their names remained respected, but the certainty that once surrounded them had weakened. Board members demanded explanations. Partners requested clarification. Opportunities that had seemed guaranteed became less certain. Nobody accused them publicly of wrongdoing, yet confidence had become harder to find. And in the modern business world, confidence was often more valuable than money itself. Through all of it, Zora Bennett returned to work the next evening. She arrived 15 minutes early, tied her apron, checked reservation lists, and prepared tables exactly as she always had. Most guests still saw a waitress carrying trays. Most had no idea what had happened inside the private dining room. Yet a few people did know. A few people remembered. One investor quietly nodded when she passed his table. Another thanked her for refilling a glass with a level of respect she had never received before. Word traveled carefully among those who had witnessed the events firsthand. They began referring to her in private conversations as the woman who had changed a $900 million decision with nothing more than knowledge and courage. But Zora never repeated the story. She never sought attention. She never called reporters. She simply continued doing her job, because she understood something many powerful people never learn. Recognition is temporary. Character is permanent. And while headlines were busy discussing deals, negotiations, and corporate strategy, the most important truth remained unchanged. The person who had protected the future of an entire company was still the same woman carrying a tray through a crowded restaurant, unnoticed by almost everyone except those who finally understood her worth. 3 weeks later, the city had moved on to new headlines, new scandals, and new victories. That is what cities do. They keep moving. But some moments leave fingerprints long after the crowd forgets. On a cool Thursday evening, Zora Bennett finished her shift and stepped out of the Meridian Crown just as the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline. The air carried the scent of rain. Yellow taxicabs rolled through the streets below. Office lights glowed from distant towers like stars trapped behind glass. Her phone vibrated. A single message appeared on the screen. It was from Claire Whitmore. The message was simple. "Would you be willing to meet tomorrow morning?" Zora stared at it for several seconds. She had not spoken to Claire since the night of the negotiations. She had expected that chapter of her life to close quietly. Instead, the following morning found her sitting inside the headquarters of Whitmore Biotech, looking out across the Hudson River from a conference room nearly 40 floors above the city. Claire entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. There were no cameras, no reporters, no executives, just 2 women sitting across from one another. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire smiled. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said. Zora nodded politely. "You already thanked me." Claire shook her head. "No, I thanked you for helping me. That is not the same thing." She placed a folder on the table. Inside was an employment offer. Not as a waitress, not as an assistant, not as a translator. The position was Director of Ethics and International Communications, a role created specifically for someone who understood both language and responsibility. Zora looked at the document and then back at Claire. "You barely know me." Claire smiled again. "Actually, I know exactly what I need to know. I know that when everyone else stayed silent, you spoke. I know that when powerful people expected you to remain invisible, you refused. And I know that integrity cannot be taught. It has to be chosen." For a moment, Zora thought about the hospital visits, the late-night shifts, the student loans, the years spent being underestimated by people who never bothered asking who she was. She thought about her mother, who had spent a lifetime teaching her that character mattered most when nobody was watching. The offer represented more than a job. It represented a door opening after years of standing outside. Months later, employees throughout Whitmore Biotech would come to know Zora as a thoughtful leader, a careful listener, and someone who valued truth more than status. Yet the most remarkable part of her story was not the promotion, the office, or the title on her business card. It was the lesson hidden beneath it all. The billionaires believed power belonged to the people speaking at the table. They were wrong. Real power belonged to the person who understood what was being said and had the courage to act when it mattered. They thought she was carrying a tray. She was carrying the truth. And on the night everyone underestimated her, the truth proved far more valuable than $900 million.